In 1796, the scientist Edward Jenner injected material from a cowpox virus into an 8-year-old boy, with a hunch that this would provide the protection needed to save people from deadly outbreaks of the related smallpox virus. It was a success. The 8-year-old was inoculated against the disease, and this became the first ever vaccine. But why did it work? To understand how vaccines function, we need to know how the immune system defends us against contagious diseases in the first place. When foreign microbes invade us, the immune system triggers a series of responses in an attempt to identify and remove them from our bodies. The signs that this immune response is working are the coughing, sneezing, inflammation, and fever we experience, which work to trap, deter, and rid the body of threatening things like bacteria. These innate immune responses also trigger our second line of defense, called adaptive immunity. Special cells called B cells and T cells are recruited to fight microbes and also record information about them, creating a memory of what the invaders look like and how best to fight them. This know-how becomes handy if the same pathogen invades the body again. But despite this smart response, there's still a risk involved. The body takes time to learn how to respond to pathogens and to build up these defenses. And even then, if a body is too weak or young to fight back when it's invaded, it might face very serious risk if the pathogen is particularly severe. But what if we could prepare the body's immune response, readying it before someone even got ill? This is where vaccines come in. Using the same principles that the body uses to defend itself, scientists use vaccines to trigger the body's adaptive immune system without exposing humans to the full-strength disease. This has resulted in many vaccines, which each work uniquely, separated into many different types. First, we have live attenuated vaccines. These are made of the pathogen itself, but a much weaker and tamer version. Next, we have inactive vaccines, in which the pathogens have been killed. The weakening and inactivation in both types of vaccine ensures that pathogens don't develop into the full-blown disease. But just like a disease, they trigger an immune response, teaching the body to recognize an attack by making a profile of pathogens in preparation. The downside is that live attenuated vaccines can be difficult to make, and because they're live and quite powerful, people with weaker immune systems can't have them, while inactive vaccines don't create long-lasting immunity. Another type, the subunit vaccine, is only made from one part of the pathogen, called an antigen, the ingredient that actually triggers the immune response. By even further isolating specific components of antigens, like proteins or polysaccharides, these vaccines can prompt specific responses.
Now, antitoxin was a treatment, but not a vaccine. It didn't confer long-term immunity because the patient's own body wasn't learning how to make antibodies. But eventually, scientists figured out how to create an inactivated form of the toxin called a toxoid. Toxoids could evoke an immune response in a healthy person without making them sick. So if the person ever encountered diphtheria in the future, their immune system would know which antibodies to produce. This is how most vaccines today are made. We use toxoids, or weak or dead versions of germs, to bring on an immune response. For example, the diphtheria and tetanus vaccines still use toxoids. The measles vaccine uses a highly weakened form of the measles virus, and the polio vaccine uses a dead virus. Now here's the thing. Toxoids are so harmless that your body sometimes doesn't bother mounting an immune response. This was initially the case with the diphtheria toxoid. It just didn't make the immune system angry enough. But back in the days of the antitoxin treatment, scientists found that when horses had a little inflammation at their injection sites, they actually produced more antitoxin. It was like the inflammation hailed more immune cells to come check out what was going on.
They found that if you could add some substances to these toxoids, you could kind of do the same thing. You get a better immune reaction from the body, and those are called adjuvants, and they're actually really critical to vaccines today.
The adjuvant used in that first diphtheria vaccine was a form of aluminum, which is still in certain vaccines today.
Our research teams have been working for more than 20 years on ways to improve vaccines by using adjuvants. An adjuvant is a substance included in a vaccine that stimulates the immune system by activating pathways that we naturally use to recognize bacteria or viruses. And in adjuvanted vaccine, the adjuvant is combined with an antigen. By carefully selecting the right adjuvant and antigen combinations, we aim to stimulate the immune system and therefore generate a specific and long-lasting immunity against the antigen, and thereby preventing infection.
This slide shows that autism and mental retardation were approximately 6 times statistically significantly more likely, and speech disorders were 2 times statistically significantly more likely following thimerosal-containing DTaP vaccines in comparison to thimerosal-free DTaP vaccines. This slide shows that autism and mental retardation were approximately 6 times statistically significantly more likely, and speech disorders were 2 times statistically significantly more likely following thimerosal-containing DTaP vaccines in comparison to thimerosal-free DTaP vaccines. The doses of mercury children were receiving from thimerosal on a given day following vaccination in comparison to the EPA, ASDR, and FDA limits of exposure to mercury are summarized in the next slide. And this is similar to a slide that Dr. Baskin showed. Give me the, yeah, this is what's in each one. Give me the next slide, please. This calculates the risks. The amount of the excess that children receive. And the way that Dr. Baskin did it was very, shall I say, charitable toward the production. Children actually receive from a 10 to 100-fold excess of mercury from their childhood vaccination on the days of immunization in comparison to the guidelines. The daily dose of mercury children received was equal to or exceeded the guideline even when averaged out for 10 days following vaccination.
They didn't even talk about the preferential uptake of mercury into the brain, which is 5-fold. Next slide. But they did find a very high stool level of mercury, and one kid had 81.3 nanograms. If you again go to the very conservative FDA data, a 50 percentile kid receives 20.7 nanograms per gram. So somehow the mercury went from the injection, ended up in a much higher level in the stool. And obviously the mercury gets to the stool by traveling through the blood. There's no rectal administration. Let me turn to some studies that we're doing at Baylor College of Medicine. We have the opportunity to actually grow human frontal cortex cells in cell culture. So these are cells from the front part of the brain that grow in culture. We incubate these cells with thimerosal at various doses, and we use a number of very sophisticated techniques to detect cell death and cell damage. Next slide. It turns out that every cell has a program inside of it to commit suicide. The reason we have this in our bodies is when we're babies, we have webs between our fingers, but when we're born, we don't have these webs. These cells are eliminated by activating a genetic program, so there's no inflammation and there's no scar tissue. We're basically start out with many more cells than we end up with. We kind of prune ourselves into shape, and this process is called apoptosis. Well, it turns out that toxic substances, including mercury, turn on this suicide program in the brain. Next slide. Here's some pictures from our cell culture experiments, and you can see the arrows pointing to those little knobs sticking off the cell. These are the cells committing the suicide program and breaking themselves into tiny little pieces with a very low dose of mercury. Next slide. Here's a slide where you see a lot of blue cells. This is a blue dye that normal cells don't take up. In order for something to turn blue, next slide please, the cell has to have holes punched in their membranes. And guess what? At an extraordinarily low dose of thimerosal, most of the cells are blue. It means that this stuff grabs a hold of the membrane and punches holes in it so that the dye can penetrate not only into the cytoplasm, but into the very center of the cell, the nucleus, where all the DNA exists. Next slide. This is a fascinating slide. The center of the cells are blue, which means there's been holes punched in the membrane so the dye gets to the center of the cell. The rest of the cell is green, which is the release of an enzyme that only gets released during the suicide program. So these cells are turned on to commit suicide or go into apoptosis. Next slide. We found this to be dose and time dependent. We found that 101 nanograms per gram is the lowest dose we've studied, and it's toxic, and we didn't even expect this to be toxic. Yet if you consider a 5 times preferential uptake and you use FDA numbers, infants receive 380.5 nanograms, 3 times the dose that we found to be toxic to brain cells. Don't forget, we did this in adult brain cells. Remember that infant brain cells are much more sensitive. So there's a real cause for concern.
Asia is a new syndrome, which means autoimmune syndromes induced by adjuvant. It's a new syndrome, which refers to several conditions that not necessarily are full characterized autoimmune diseases like systemic lupus or rheumatoid arthritis or scleroderma, which are induced by chronic stimulation of the immune system by substances which may react as adjuvants, namely that they stimulate chronically the immune system in some time for the benefits of the subject to get an immune reaction, but in this case the reaction is unnecessary and leads to the emergence of these new signs and symptoms. By and large, most probably the AGI is due to the chronic stimulation of the immune system. Having said that, there are some specific adjuvants which were already shown to induce the AGI. For instance, the aluminium. Aluminium is the oldest, the cheapest, and the most efficient adjuvant so far. And this is the reason why it is employed in so many vaccines, even nowadays. In a syndrome called macrophage myofasciitis syndrome, or MMF, described first by Romain Girardi in France, he showed that the children and the adults who were vaccinated by hepatitis C virus, which contains the aluminium, they developed this severe myalgia with the neurological manifestations, including cognitive impairment and some kind of dizziness and inability to concentrate, as well as unfresh sleep. And following many studies, he was able to demonstrate that the aluminium is deposited in the muscle and then wanders from the muscles via the macrophages to different organs and especially penetrate the blood-brain barrier. So the MMF is actually part of the AGI syndrome.
Some of the vaccines and the ingredients in the vaccines we've heard about could be aluminum, could be mercury. Is there some concern that when these ingredients are given to such young children that as we've heard, their immune systems are not completely developed yet, if it stays in their system and or stays in their brain and does not come out of their system, as what we've heard is it's supposedly supposed to leave their system? What are your thoughts on that?
Well, you heard earlier that there's no real concern about aluminum because it's such a small amount, and so it really shouldn't matter. But the kind of aluminum that we put into vaccines is a different kind of aluminum that we see environmentally. This is called a nanoparticle, and nanoparticles bind really tightly to the bacteria antigens, the virus antigens, the food protein antigens, and any other contaminants that are in the vaccines that we may not know about. And we know that the biochemical properties of nanoparticles is that they are capable of entering the brain. And so we have not evaluated the safety of the aluminum nanoparticle and its injection and where it goes when it gets into the body and whether it gets into the brain. Do vaccine ingredients belong in the brain? No. Do they get into the brain? No one has ever studied it. But animal studies using the same chemicals that are in vaccines that we give to children directly demonstrate that the vaccine ingredients do enter the brain. We are ignoring this information. There are scientists in Europe who've actually done studies on the aluminum nanoparticle and have shown that it can persist in the brain for years and decades. And so what we're seeing is a large outbreak of neurodevelopmental disabilities in adults, including Alzheimer's. And one of the main factors that they're finding in the brains of people with Alzheimer's is the aluminum nanoparticle that's directly related to the vaccines that we're giving.
Time now for perspective, and vaccines have been credited with reducing some of the world's most deadly diseases. But while the market for vaccinations has tripled since the turn of the century, representing over $25 billion a year, and is expected to continue to rise rapidly, questions over the safety and effectiveness of many of them remain. As new diseases develop or mutate, the speed with which some injections are produced has also been a source of question. Well, with fear comes rejection, which is also also said to result in some unfavourable outcomes. The number of measles infections last year in the European Union 3 times what it was in 2016. Notably, authorities said because people decided not to get immunised. So how can one know whether or not to get those jabs? Well, today we're joined by the medical director of a clinic that specialises in vaccinations for babies. Joining us live from London to give us his views, Dr. Richard Halverson. Thanks so much for your time, Dr. Halverson. Now, you run a vaccination clinic that, you know, and according to your book, you're not at all anti-vaccinations, but you do feel sometimes there's an exaggeration over the good they can do. But is there a danger to vaccinations?
I'm very concerned, Eve, about the direction that we're going with vaccinations at the moment. We're adding more and more vaccines to our schedules. Often in some countries, they're becoming compulsory, as I believe that is the case in France. And some of these diseases we're vaccinating against now actually are really very mild or almost impossible to contract. Let's be clear, vaccines can save lives. There's no question about that. But also all vaccines have side effects. And the side effects of vaccines has unfortunately been downplayed by the establishment in order to encourage and promote uptake. Now, that has led some parents, quite understandably, to question the benefit of the vaccines. And then we've got other extremes where parents are saying that vaccines are the cause of all evil. The truth is that vaccines offer benefit, but some vaccines offer more benefit than others. We pool them all together. And if you go to your doctor, you'll be told, well, you must have all these vaccines. These are essential for your child. Otherwise, you're putting your child at risk. That's not quite true. There are some vaccines that are clearly of benefit and other vaccines that are not of benefit, and they need to be distinguished, and we need to look between them. And
before we get into maybe distinguish them slightly, Dr. Halverson, you know, what are the types of side effects? Like, are they really significant side effects, or, you know, is it better to take that rather than getting the risk of many diseases?
Well, that again depends on the vaccine. Some vaccine, the benefit outweighs the risk, and some vaccines, in my view, the risks clearly outweigh the benefits. Now, all vaccines have side effects, like any medicine. Anytime you take a tablet or a drug or a vaccine, there's the risk of side effects. And occasionally, that risk is severe. The side effects, severe side effects can happen. Governments wouldn't have vaccine damage injury compensation programs if they didn't acknowledge that there was a real risk of serious side effects, albeit rare. There is an additional problem, is that we're very uncertain about the long-term effects of vaccines. They have a profound effect on the immune system, and we're adding more and more and more to the schedule. And we know that vaccines can cause autoimmune diseases. We know that vaccines can cause allergies. We don't know what sort of problems they may be building up for the future. And so we should be more cautious when we add more and more vaccines to the schedule for diseases that are less important. Measles is making a comeback. Measles is an interesting one. The risk of measles is actually exaggerated. I'm not saying we shouldn't vaccinate. I think there is a case for vaccination against measles because measles can be serious, though it is rarely serious in healthy children. When I was young, we all caught measles, and we didn't actually live in fear of it, though I quite agree that measles can be dangerous, again, usually in children with serious underlying health problems. Interestingly as well, measles also has benefits. If you contract measles as a child, providing you get through it healthily, of course, the risks of allergies is reduced, the risk of asthma is reduced, even the risk of some childhood cancers, such as lymphoma and leukemia, is reduced. This is good science. This is published scientific papers. So I'm not saying we shouldn't vaccinate, but we should just have a debate about the benefits and the risks. But it's not as clear cut as some people believe.
So as we start talking about these new mRNA vaccines, the first question that comes to mind is, well, how do these vaccines actually work? Before we jump into that, let's take a quick step back and understand some cellular biology. So kind of the traditional dogma of cellular biology is, DNA, which is sort of our blueprint for our cells, undergoes transcription, and that gets transcribed into RNA, messenger RNA usually, but there's other types of RNA. And then the RNA, through messenger RNA, gets translated into proteins. And proteins, of course, can serve a whole bunch of different purposes. They can be structural. An example would be collagen. They can be functional. A good example of that would be enzymes or receptors. And they can serve communication purposes as well. So hormones or, again, receptors on cell surfaces. So those are some very high-level classifications of proteins. But traditionally, this is how we go from DNA to protein. So, of course, it's much more complicated than that, and we don't have time to get into that level of detail. Do know that there's a lot more that happens, and this is very much a simplification just for the purposes of maybe reintroducing the concept of DNA, RNA, and in particular messenger RNA or mRNA, and how mRNA translates into protein. So basically what we're doing is we've developed the ability to manipulate genetic material, DNA, RNA, pretty much at will. And so what we're able to do is use mRNA and turn our cells into miniature manufacturing facilities. So we can inject mRNA that codes for the things that we want to encode for into our bodies, or and get the cells to take up that mRNA, and then that mRNA can be translated directly into antigens. So let's take a look at how that works. So first we take mRNA, which codes for the desired antigen, and we introduce it into the patient. The mRNA gets into the cells, and there's a bunch of different ways that can happen depending on the type of mRNA that we're using. And then, just as with all mRNA, once it gets into the cytosol, inside the cell, it's translated, and so it gets turned into the antigen protein or amino acid chain that we instructed that mRNA to code for. And then basically we've produced a whole bunch of antigenic protein or antigenic amino acid sequences, and so that generates an immune reaction against our bodies then actually generate an immune reaction against the antigen that we've made our cells synthesize for us. And then once we have an immune reaction against that, our immune memory essentially prevents infection with from that pathogen upon re-exposure to that pathogen down the road. So that's really kind of how this works. Again, instead of having the manufacturing happen in some really expensive facility, we're turning our cells into vaccine manufacturing plants. Now, as with traditional vaccines, mRNA technology has some significant advantages as well as some significant disadvantages. So let's take a look at those. We'll start off with the disadvantages because it's helpful to discuss those first before we get into some of the advantages. The first thing is that our bodies are designed to rapidly degrade genetic material outside of cells. And there's a whole bunch of different ways that that happens, but naked DNA or RNA that lives outside of cells does not last long. And if you think about it, that makes sense. If you have a foreign pathogen, a virus, something else's tissue, that gets into your body because of an injury or something along those lines, you don't want that hanging around. You want to degrade that as quickly as possible. Likewise, when our cells die for whatever reason and they expel all the intracellular contents into the extracellular space, there's a lot of DNA, RNA stuff that's hanging around that was critical to the function of that cell. We don't want that hanging around and potentially being sucked up by other cells or causing problems. So there's a lot of systems in the body that are designed to degrade genetic material as soon as it basically leaves the cellular space. So when we're talking about using mRNA vaccine technology, we need to take some steps to minimize the extracellular degradation of the mRNA. And there's a few different ways we can do that. One is by encapsulating the mRNA into lipid nanoparticles. And so that has some advantages in that it may increase cellular uptake. We can make modifications to mRNA to reduce or prevent degradation that might allow for a quote-unquote naked but modified mRNA to be injected directly and then potentially allow for cellular uptake and then translation into protein. And then there's some interesting technology related to self-amplifying or self-replicating mRNA. Typically that has to somehow get inside the cell before it's able to self-amplify or self-replicate. But there's some interesting aspects of that as well to allow a very small dose to amplify over time if we ever needed that. Now, another thing is that there's a risk of reaction to mRNA-based vaccines, especially if you're using naked mRNA. And that's because, again, extracellular RNA is it's something that triggers an innate immune response, and that innate immune response can be quite powerful. So there is something called a pathogen-associated molecular pattern, or a PAMP, P-A-M-P. And what that does is basically something that's so conserved from one organism to the next that when our body encounters it, we know it's not good and it's something we need to respond against. So it doesn't even require, an adaptive immune response. It's part of our built-in innate immunity. And when some of those PAMP or PAMP receptors recognize RNA, whether it's single-stranded RNA or double-stranded RNA, that can trigger a very potent interferon response. And if you remember some of the side effects from interferons from pharmacy school, it's not pleasant, and that can generate some very nasty adverse effects.
Now, they're going to do it differently. Recently, a radically new approach to vaccination has been developed. And this is where it gets interesting. It involves the direct introduction into appropriate tissues of a plasmid containing the DNA sequence encoding the antigen or gens against which an immune response is sought, and relies on the in situ production of the target antigen. So now you're introducing DNA, the building blocks of life. Sometimes they introduce it in the form of RNA, which is a single strand and not a double helix. Now, DNA and RNA from a foreign source will not enter your nucleus. The nucleus, I'm going to use the word designed, is magnificently designed. The whole cell is a marvel that will keep the scientific minds occupied for a lifetime. And the nuclear membrane has ports with gates, with keys and locks, to put it simply. And substances must enter in and come out through this nuclear pore. And certain large molecules, like RNA, for example, that is produced when proteins are to be made, the DNA will encode for RNA. The RNA will then be transported through the nuclear membrane, through these pores, through the gateway, which will open up to the exact formation of what has to pass through, so that only that passes through and nothing else. Because the composition of the nucleus is different to the cytoplasm on the outside. And this is such a precise way. So nothing can actually enter that nucleus that doesn't pass through the gatekeeper, right? So when they introduce DNA or RNA into the cell and they want to get it into your replicating site, into the nucleus, they have to use a nanoparticle to carry it in, otherwise the body would destroy it. It wouldn't get in. So you're fooling the body, you're fooling the cell to take in a substance which is foreign. You are now introducing foreign genetic material into your system. That can actually be incorporated and become part of you. So you become someone else to what you really are, genetically speaking. And they are enforced using the body's own system to now create the process to deal with whatever the vector is. The field of DNA vaccination is developing rapidly. Vaccines currently being developed use not only DNA, but also include adjuncts that assist DNA to enter cells. As I was explaining, you need a vehicle. You need a transport mechanism. You're going to override the natural defense of the body to let any foreign DNA come into your system. If it's a retrovirus, it can reverse itself into and even splice into your own DNA, so becoming part of you, right? Sure. Then you are a GMO human. You have been genetically modified. Yes. Okay. So it includes this target, or that it may act as an adjunct in stimulating or directing the immune response. Ultimately, the distinction between a sophisticated DNA vaccine and a simple viral vector may not be clear. Interesting. Many aspects of the immune response generated by DNA vaccines are not understood.
So we got a new benchmark for when we can get back to normal, when we get a vaccine. Everything will be fine once we can vaccinate against COVID-19. Many in authority told us that. They're still telling us that. The state of Virginia has announced that when a vaccine finally does arrive, it will be mandatory. Not all vaccines. Virginia will not require vaccines for hepatitis or HIV. They won't require a vaccine for meningitis either, despite the fact that meningitis kills a lot more, say, college students than coronavirus does. But once we get a corona vaccine, they're telling us, all will be well. But now they've changed that. It's not true anymore. According to a new announcement from the World Health Organization, a vaccine, even if we get one, will not be the end of all of this. It will never end. You can get your injection, they'll make you get it, but you'll still be under arrest. The World Health Organization says that finding a vaccine is not the goal. Reordering society is the goal. Quote, we cannot go back to the way things were. That's a direct quote from the leader of the World Health Organization, Dr. Tedros, who, by the way, is not really a doctor. Because COVID-19 is not a public health crisis, really, or even a mere virus. According to Tedros, COVID-19 is, in fact, and this may surprise you, COVID-19 is really about global warming. As he puts it, quote, the COVID-19 pandemic has given new impetus to the need to accelerate efforts to respond to climate change. I bet you didn't see that coming. Bill Gates did. He agrees with it wholeheartedly. Earlier this month, Gates posted an essay to his personal website, which you probably haven't seen, arguing that the lesson of the corona pandemic is that the rest of us will have to sacrifice even more to save the Earth from warming. Now, for people who are not billionaire global influencers, this is all pretty confusing. Quick, what does the coronavirus have to do with climate change? Well, for one thing, China caused both of them. That's the obvious link. But that is definitely not the point Dr. Tedros and Bill Gates are making. Both of them bow before China. They would never meaningfully criticize the Chinese government. So you can be assured that's not the connection they're drawing. No. For Dr. Tedros and Bill Gates, pandemic and climate change share a very different connection. Both are useful pretexts for mass social control. Both are essentially unsolvable crises they can harness to bypass democracy and force powerless populations to obey their commands. How would a rational person assess global warming? If you really believe that carbon emissions were distorting the Earth's climate, and that's the claim they make, maybe they're right, then you would take a very close look at the forces behind those carbon emissions. You would ask hard questions about the global economy. You'd wonder, who's profiting from this system that's destroying the Earth? How exactly do the richest, most powerful people in the world, that would be big finance and the tech monopolies, contribute to carbon emissions? That would be the first question you would ask. That's the logical way to think about climate change. And if you began to think that way, you might wind up concluding that people like, I don't know, Michael Bloomberg were in fact climate criminals. Their private jets alone produce more carbon emissions a year than entire African villages do, not to mention more than your neighborhood does, a lot more. But tellingly, no one on the environmental left ever criticizes Michael Bloomberg. He's considered a leader in the fight against climate change. Here's another data point for you that you won't see on television. Less than a month ago, on July 31st, the CDC, Centers for Disease Control in Atlanta, our primary public health organization, funded by the federal government, released guidelines to state health departments about patients infected with the coronavirus. How do you track the spread of this disease? In a footnote in the release, the CDC acknowledged that researchers lack evidence that, quote, masks offer any protection against coronavirus, any, at all. As health officials work to track the spread of the virus, the CDC suggested that they ignore whether or not people were wearing masks. In other words, wearing a mask may be completely irrelevant to the spread of the virus. Huh? So there is still no proof that masks protect us against COVID-19? That is apparently the conclusion the CDC reached. It's not something Trump tweeted. The CDC put that in a release to the states. It seems like a blockbuster story. Why isn't that on page 1 of the New York Times? Why is the entire media, the entire leadership class of the United States of America ignoring this? Masks are obligatory. They're mandatory everywhere. Just the other day, Joe Biden announced that if he's elected, you will be required to wear a mask when you're alone outside. What is going on? You know what's going on. Fear works. The more afraid you are, the more you will accept. Again, a feature of human nature. The more cut off you are from your family and your friends, the more power they have to control you.
As we race to develop a coronavirus vaccine, some major questions are emerging.
A lot of people are wondering if the government could force people to get it, or could people who refuse get banned from stores or lose their jobs.
Imagine a world where you have to get vaccinated and show proof to go shopping, board a plane, or just go to work. Legally, it could happen, says University of San Diego law professor Dov Fox.
States can compel vaccinations in more or less intrusive ways. They can limit access to schools or services or jobs if people don't get vaccinated. It could force them to pay a fine or even lock them up in jail. Those measures have been adopted in other countries like France, but not so far in the United States. Courts have found that when medical necessity requires it, the public health outweighs the individual rights and liberties at stake.
Professor Fox says states would need to allow exemptions for people with legitimate medical risks like pregnancy, but not exemptions for other reasons.
Religious exemptions, philosophical ones, have largely been overridden in the name of public health.
And legal experts say that private businesses would have the authority to fire workers who don't want to get vaccinated for personal or religious reasons. Companies would just need to show that there are significant costs at stake for having unvaccinated employees.
Digital transformation is changing the way we manage our data, our information, our interactions, and our identities online. The United Nations is ready to digitally transform how it deals with identity, with a system to streamline information sharing, daily workflows, access to platforms and buildings, operating across agencies, by providing its personnel with a universal system-wide identity solution. Introducing the UN Digital ID, a unique and digital identity for UN personnel from the day you join to the day you part. All of your personal, HR, medical, travel, security, payroll and pension data in the palm of your hand, giving you full control on what you share and with whom. With blockchain and biometrics, the UN Digital ID makes verification efficient, secure, transparent, immutable, portable and universal. It's been piloted by different agencies and the UN Pension Fund, where they've replaced current manual processes with certainty for who and where pension recipients say they are at any given time. Imagine a regional field officer has just joined the UN. She uses the mobile app to obtain a digital wallet. stored securely in her smartphone and only accessible to her with biometrics. Even better than a physical wallet, she can store all her credentials issued by any UN organization in her digital wallet. She has immediate access to course certificates, travel clearances from UNDSS, medical records from allergies to vaccinations, also making any transfer to another organization a breeze. As innovation transforms the world, we can improve the way we manage our identities online. UN Digital IDs, a building block for digital cooperation, unlocking the promise of the SDGs.